All right, we're going to get started with our closing keynote. Nichole, it's so nice to see your face. um, my name is Liz Baxter, and I am the CEO for the North Sound Accountable Community of Health. And before introducing our closing keynote, I have a couple of just Zoom housekeeping reminders for you. First, the audience is muted and your video cameras are turned off, so you should only see the panelists on your screen. If you've got technology issues, you can go ahead and put them in the chat box. This is the only option to chat the panelists, but the entire audience won't see your chats. And we've got some amazing tech gurus who are going to see the chats and they'll respond to you individually also via the chat box. If you've got questions for Nichole Maher, please use the Q&A box, which should be down at the bottom of your screen as one of the icons. And we're going to do our best to get to as many questions as possible in the time that we've got. We are recording this session, as we have all of the sessions this week, and they'll all be available on the website by end of the week, which is www.washingtonach.org. And so now I have the honor of introducing our closing keynote speaker. Nichole Maher joined the Group Health Foundation as president and CEO in October of 2018, after spending 6 years as the CEO of the Northwest Health Foundation. Under her guidance, Northwest Health Foundation became a national forerunner in equity and a champion of supporting communities to improve their own health. Prior to that, Nichole served for 11 years as executive director of Native American Youth and Family Center, an organization widely recognized as having one of the most effective and innovative wraparound family service models for Native Americans in the United States. One of Nichole's most satisfying and impactful accomplishments was the co-founding of the Coalition of Communities of Color, a powerful advocacy group in Oregon and across the region. Nichole has served on a number of governing boards, including Grantmakers in Health, Philanthropy Northwest, the National Urban Indian Family Coalition, and Northwest Indian College Foundation. She holds an MPH, a Master's in Public Health, from the Marco Hatfield School of Government at Portland State University. And she also completed a fellowship at Harvard Medical School and the Robert Wood Johnson Minority Medical Education Program at Yale Medical School. She's proud of her Alaskan heritage and her connection to rural communities across Washington and Oregon, and is the mother of 3 young children. So I'm exhausted already just reading all of that. But I can't, before turning it over, just say that Nichole and I actually met taking a class at Portland State in the Masters of Public Health program. I believe she was in a class. I was probably the oldest person in the cohort of the MPH program. And just even in that class felt this kind of synergy. And, I can't even remember if that was like 15 years ago, it was a long time ago. Just have so enjoyed being on this journey with you as we have traversed healthcare reform and advancing equity in Oregon and now in Washington. So Nichole, I'm going to turn it to you. Thank you so much for being here with us, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Liz. I cannot say enough about how much I adore Liz Baxter. And I'll just say, I would follow that lady anywhere. And I think that graduate class may have been longer than 15 years ago, Liz, but I really appreciate that. I'm delighted to be here today with all of you, and honored to really serve in the role of helping you close out an incredibly important gathering. Like many of you, I call the Pacific Northwest home. I was born a little farther north in Southeast Alaska in my maternal tribal community on the island of Kupernak. And when I was 10, we moved to my father's home state, which is the state of Washington. And while he grew up in central and eastern Washington and still has about 1,000 cousins there, we actually moved to the Olympic Peninsula because my dad was a logger and a fisherman, and it was the early 80s, and it was a really hard economic time. We eventually moved one more time to the Siletz Indian Reservation, another small coastal community. And I share this because growing up as a Native woman in rural communities has taught me the most important lessons of my life. These lessons prepared me for my first job as a CEO at the Native American Youth and Family Center, and it taught me to be an advocate and to work alongside other communities who have been invisible, ignored, and often actively silenced. It's how I became an advocate, and being an advocate is how I came to philanthropy. First, as the CEO of Northwest Health Foundation, and then, as Liz shared, the CEO of Group Health Foundation in October of 2018. Joining Group Health Foundation offered me the chance to have an explicit and unapologetic focus on health equity, and to build a new foundation that hopefully will be truly statewide and in authentic relationship with community. At that time, Group Health Foundation was brand new, just 5 people strong. And just as a reminder, Group Health Foundation was born out of the sale of Group Health Cooperative to Kaiser Permanente. And when that sale happened, all of the assets or the proceeds from that sale were placed in a brand new 501c4 organization focused on systems change and community-driven solutions. Now, launching a $2 billion startup, as you can imagine, is no small task. And it required everything in those early days, from finding a new office to building organizational infrastructure to creating our investment office that manages all of our assets and investments. And we did other things too. That fall, we hung pictures, we learned how to use a new copier, and we prepared to hire a whole bunch of people. And amid all of that energy and excitement, I began to pick up on several clues about how difficult it was going to be for us to become a truly authentic statewide organization. I began to realize that there might be more hurdles in my way than I had realized. And when I think back about it, I realized that my first clues actually came long before I had even started. Like most jobs, the announcement went out about 5 months before I began. And once that announcement went out, I began to have folks from philanthropy, the public sector, health systems, and nonprofit leaders began to reach out to me. And I was really overwhelmed and really appreciative. And I want to say that I was struck to notice that I had received over 1,000 emails. And I know that sounds quirky because I counted them. And I want to share that I counted them because I started noticing some trends. 990 of these emails actually came from Seattle. And I'm not talking about South King County or Everett or Snohomish. I'm talking about the city of Seattle. I got 3 emails from Spokane, and all of those great folks were folks who had deep connections to Group Health Cooperative. And I got a little over a dozen emails from the rest of the state, and they were all from people I actually already knew because, of course, I had worked for about 20 years in Southwest Washington. And the other thing that was interesting was that the overwhelming majority of them started with this line: "Welcome to Seattle." And of course, many of them started with "Welcome to Washington." And this was surprising for me and frankly, very confusing. You just heard my very long bio, and it's very clear, and every time I share about who I am, that my deep roots and my family in Eastern and Central Washington for many generations is really important about who I am. The fact that my dad graduated from Royal City High School, the fact that I spent such a significant and important part of my childhood in the Olympic Peninsula, it's such a big piece of me. And then certainly not to mention those 20 years I spent working in those Southwest Washington counties are really important to the professional person I am today. I certainly didn't have the heart to respond and let people know that I wasn't actually even moving to Seattle, that I was in fact moving to Kitsap County at the heart of the Suquamish Nation. And while I was really incredibly grateful for the warm welcome, these were kind-hearted and well-intentioned people welcoming me to my new role, I couldn't help but hear this other message, an unintentional message, but one that was crystal clear all the same. And this message that I was literally hearing hundreds and hundreds of times was, "You're not from here." And this was a profound experience for me because I have always identified as a Washingtonian. In my mind, I was coming home. And I began to travel down a path of inquiry and began to try to understand where folks were coming from and try to understand the deeper dynamics across the state. And as I began to listen and have conversations with so many of those folks who had emailed me, I began to see and hear a pattern of thoughts shared over and over again. Folks recognizing the importance of inequity and the need to address it, but often only thinking about that from a worldview that is centered in Seattle. Maybe sometimes Tacoma and Spokane, but not as often. They also spoke passionately about the need for structural reform and social, political, and economic change, but again, very much in the context of Seattle. And the more we talked and the more I realized that there was a kind of cataloging that was happening, very much along geographic and class lines. This idea that people living in Seattle are diverse, progressive, innovative, forward-thinking, and that folks in Central, Eastern, Southwest Washington, well, basically everywhere else, there's this perception that everyone was white, that everyone was conservative, and even words like backwards were used on occasion. And when folks would describe small cities outside of the I-5 corridor, language like this would come forward. We need to train people to be leaders. We need to help those communities start nonprofits, or even ideas around sending people from more populated areas or young college graduates out there so that they could bring their expertise and skills to solve problems in those communities. Sometimes I chime in saying, "Hey, I just visited Moses Lake," or "I just got back from Shelton, and have you seen what's happening in Pasco?" Sharing examples of awesome leaders, amazing organizations I'd met, specifically sharing stories of the tremendous work tribal nations are doing across this state to solve challenging solutions with very little resources. And the response I would often get, "It must be so sad to see all that poverty. How do you have the fortitude or the energy to keep going on all those trips? You must be so exhausted." And I'll say it again, these were good people. These are good people. And what struck out to me was this incredible temptation they were experiencing to view themselves, and so often me by default, as a savior. They'd say, "We really need to get some resources to those communities. How do we help them get educated? How do we engage them?" And it was always them, they, those people. And the last one I'll share is this: how do we help them to stop voting against their own best interest? And I'll be honest, that last one hurts. It hurts even as I say it out loud today. So I want to unpack it a little bit. This claim that people are voting against their own interests assumes that you know what a person's perspective and experience is. And you are essentially saying you know more about what is best for that person than they do. We insert our own view of what we think is in someone else's best interest, essentially saying we know better than them. that they are incapable of making the right decisions for themselves. Others must step in. Others know better. Now, I want to be very clear right now. Those stories, those messages that I just heard or just shared about who Washington is, this is a false narrative about our state. And it's a false narrative that serves a purpose. And it's not a false narrative that's coming from somewhere far away. It's a narrative in our sector, in the sector of public health, healthcare, social services, and certainly in philanthropy. Now, you might be thinking, what purpose could telling these stories about Washington serve? Well, think of it this way. If we tell the story that we are not diverse, that our rural communities are all white, or that even Seattle is not diverse, then it isn't our fault that we don't hire or promote people of color often enough. When we say there are no nonprofits in certain parts of the state, then it isn't our fault that most philanthropic and government dollars go to major and mid-sized cities and they stay along the I-5 corridor. If we say there aren't leaders from every corner of the state, then we can continue to make decisions for them and center ourselves as the experts offering the solutions for other people rather than benefiting from their expertise. We simply can't find leaders from small and rural towns who have the capacity and resources to serve on our boards. How many of you have heard that? This is another example. If we pretend that those folks don't exist, then we can consent to statewide boards that don't look like who Washington is today. When we say these words, we are choosing to underestimate the very people who all of our success is entirely dependent on. If we truly accept that people who live on low incomes, people with disabilities, immigrants, Black folks, tribes, and people of color, if we accept that they are experts in their own lives and have real solutions to offer, then we will have to fundamentally change how we do everything. We would have to try and imagine a world where you and I don't hold quite so much power and we don't get to make as many decisions as we do today. We would have to admit that we have all been part of holding up and affirming systems of inequity. Now, we certainly don't have all the answers at Group Health Foundation, and the only thing we know for certain is that we have already made many mistakes and we will make many more. But I can share that a core value at GHF is that communities most impacted are the greatest experts and best able to design their own solutions. And when we share this, almost everyone enthusiastically agrees with us. The words are easy to say, but changing our habits and putting this into practice is a whole different story. And I've been watching our state struggle with this very issue. I've been in dozens of conversations where folks agree with this sentiment and even celebrate the idea of centering community voice. And then it's often followed by a deep breath and then a pitch or a solution for a part of the state that they don't live in or a community they're not part of. Sometimes they're good ideas and sometimes they're not. And when I realized all of this, those 1,000+ emails I'd received, they began to make sense. We think we know each other, but I'm not sure we do. And because of this, we create opportunity for deep misunderstanding, and we miss out on so much. Instead, we default to stereotypes in place of real relationships. And when we don't have real relationships, we miss out on the real story of who Washington is. Now, we sought to hear from Washingtonians all across the state. And when we did that, we made the intentional choice to prioritize those who've been carrying the biggest burdens of disparity through no fault of their own. We knew that the path ahead for us at GHF was to build a reflective, authentic, and unified statewide organization. And to do this, we knew we had to find the right first teachers, people who could guide us towards a better understanding of the communities we aspire to partner with. Now, some of you may be unfamiliar with this term, so I'll share. First teachers are the ones who help you understand the complexity of a community, its relationship to the land, its history, and the history that's both good and bad. They help frame the narrative for everything that follows. Great first teachers also help you understand what's possible. They help you see your own biases. They uncover where things are contradictory, but most importantly, they help expand your imagination. Fortunately, one of our team members, Brenda Onabaro, has exceptional skills and is incredibly knowledgeable about how to build strong, trusting relationships. And she was able to find amazing organizations and brilliant leaders in every corner of the state. And she's still discovering and meeting new people, probably as I'm here chatting with all of you. And in 2019, our team and I traveled to all 39 counties in Washington. Most of the counties we visited 4 and 5 times, and we met with hundreds of people. And as I mentioned, we centered people of color, tribal nations, folks with disabilities, victims of violence, and a whole host of really important voices we needed to hear and learn from. And we made the choice that only after our 4th or 5th visit to these communities that we would then begin to meet with elected officials, public health directors, other foundations. And these community visits taught us so much. We heard so much valuable and candid advice. And I cannot even begin to tell you some of the lessons we learned. But there are 3 things I wanted to share with you that we heard over and over and over again. The first is that people across Washington do not feel safe on a variety of levels. We heard about police violence in small towns, rural communities, reservations, urban places. We heard about immigration raids and abuses of power. We heard about violence in the home, bullying in schools. The second is that we heard over and over again about loneliness and structural isolation. Initially, we thought we would hear a lot about the diseases of despair, but communities are so wise. And once again, they really brought us back to the root causes, how communities have been disconnected, separated from one another, and that sense of belonging is missing. And the last is this, that racism is hurting Washington in every corner of this state. And more specifically, that a lack of representation in our decision makers is getting in the way of solutions that match who Washington is today. It turns out a lot of people across this state have gotten the message that they are not from here or that they don't belong. It turns out that when you add up all those folks who feel other, it ends up being the majority of the people who live in this state. And I want to add a caveat before I move on and say these things that I shared that we heard, this is before we faced the global pandemic and before we saw protests and a reckoning with racism rise up in every corner of this state. I also want to say that I'm going to dive a little bit deeper in that third learning because it's October 28th. The election is almost here. And I think it's really important to name that in almost every community we visited, people were noticing that their governments, their public health departments, their school districts, and so many other institutional leaders did not reflect their lived experience and frankly just didn't match the demographics of their community. Washingtonians were noticing this long before it hit the news. And people use lots of different words to describe this in different places. But the most important thing is that folks were talking about the fact that it's a problem that our state's decision makers don't match who we are today and certainly not tomorrow. White men only comprise about 35% of our state's total population. And yet this demographic is highly overrepresented in all positions of decision-making and governance. Wealthy people and landowners are wildly overrepresented in positions of power across this state. So let's talk about who Washington State actually is. I don't have the new census numbers, so I have to use some old census numbers, but about 33% of the people who live in the state are people of color and immigrants. According to our Department of Education, 49% of all children who attend public school in the state of Washington are people of color and immigrants. And don't even get me started on what our kindergarten class looks like this year. So let's talk about who leads us. Well, only 15% of our legislators identify as people of color, only 10% of our senators, 1% of our county commissioners, and 1% of our public health directors. I'm talking about one measure of representative leadership, and that's race. But it does not get better when you talk about geography, disability, or wealth in our state's representation. A democracy, by definition, is intended to represent the people who imbue it with the power and authority to govern. We should try this sometime in Washington. Now, today, this Zoom room is filled with so many experts and leaders in health. Experts in a broad continuum of all the ways that health happens in our state. And I would contend that you have a responsibility to lead in health equity and more explicitly to lead in ending racism. Racism is the public health crisis of our lifetime. And we can't achieve health equity or end racism if we don't ask ourselves some hard questions about who gets to lead, who gets to decide where money goes, and whose solutions get prioritized and implemented. I will say it again. These are the very people who all of our success is entirely dependent on. Well, you may be asking, how do you do this? What does that actually look like? And I have prepared a set of invitations for you. First and foremost, I want to invite you to adopt a truthful narrative about who Washington is and shed those old, outdated stories that allow for the very excuses that hold us all back. Interrupt your friends and colleagues when they are contributing to harmful narratives. Remind them to be better. Interrupt them when they are reinforcing simplistic frames like the rural and urban divide, those frames that invisibilize whole populations and deny our multiracial and multicultural present and future. Be truthful with your words. Don't describe things as equity work unless it is actually the hard, disruptive work that recenters the voices of those most impacted. When you water down the word equity, you are watering down the dreams of whole communities. Dreams that these communities have for justice, fairness, and a chance for opportunity and freedom. Remember that civic health is vitally important to the well-being of everyone in Washington. And it isn't something that sits outside of public health, as uncomfortable as that may make you feel. Support initiatives working towards reflective decision-making and start with your own organization, start with your own board, and join larger coalitions advancing this vital work. And invest in the self-determination of people and nonprofits that work to make equity a reality. They exist all over our state. Support their advocacy efforts and promote civic health and true democracy. Remember to listen to your first teachers and find more first teachers and do the hard work of relationship building. There is no replacement for getting on a Zoom call and looking someone in the eye, picking up the phone, and when it's safe again, driving somewhere and introducing yourself. And last, we must remember that beautiful community organizations and brilliant local leaders are all around us. And they have always been there. They know what health equity looks like for their people, and they know how to lead us all there. With that, I will conclude my remarks and open myself up to any questions.
Nichole, thank you so much. I do want to remind the folks who are on the call that they can put their questions in the Q&A box. I'm curious, just thinking of your work with not only within your own foundation, but other tables of philanthropy. If you see philanthropy in general taking similar steps to what you've just described group health is doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have seen some good movement in the right direction, but not enough. So between 2000 and 2010, the overall grant making and investment in communities of color went from roughly about 2% to somewhere between 8 to 10%, depending on which study you look at. And then from 2010 to 2020, it's been really interesting because as a sector, philanthropy has sent lots of emails, changed lots of language on our website. We've started using the word equity left and right, but the dollars have not actually changed. We still as a field hover at around 8 to 10% giving to organizations centered, led by, and accountable to communities of color. It's actually worse for organizations that are led by folks with disabilities. We know in Washington State that there are incredible disparities about where philanthropic dollars go related to geography. And so we're a sector that is, when I talk about watering down the words and needing to speak the truth, I'm trying to hold myself accountable, and I'm speaking to my own sector along with a whole bunch of other sectors. So we've had some modest improvement, but I think we're at real risk for taking words that communities have fought decades to center and relabeling the work that that really isn't equity work and kind of making it equity work so that we can avoid criticism. And so I guess when I think about who's doing it really well, I think about the Marguerite Casey Foundation, who 30 years ago, under the leadership of Luz Vega Marquis, really began to think through building civic power, supporting communities most impacted. And today, when you look around the country and you see some of the most important political wins in places like Florida, in California, really important community voice and leadership happening, it's because the Marguerite Casey Foundation began to fund them, 2015, 10 years ago. So I admire their work because they have a long-term horizon, they make general operating supports, and they center those leaders. And so that's one of many foundations that we are stealing lots of their good ideas from.
So we've had a question from Jesse Dean, and his question is, HCA is a state agency that needs to comply with complex federal requirements. So what should HCA do to succeed in health equity efforts?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any federal requirements that prohibit you from having a profoundly diverse board. I'm not aware of any federal requirements that prohibit you from hiring brilliant leaders of many different backgrounds. And so, what I would really recommend is taking the time to really spend time with your colleagues and think long and hard about what you're afraid of. Are you afraid of getting in trouble? Are you afraid of losing resources? Are you afraid of losing power? And what are the actual rules that are holding you back? Because I suspect you know what to do, or what you know where things need to change. And, once upon a time, I led an organization with a bunch of federal grants and a bunch of other kinds of grants and about 200 different funding streams. And I don't know how many hundreds of rules we needed to follow. But I think if you can really center yourself in what you're nervous or afraid of, what's the worst thing that could happen, and then work backwards to really figure out, like, what are there actual rules that are holding you back? Or is it the complexity? Or in my experience, there's sort of like, there's the rules and then there's the unwritten rules. And sometimes the unwritten rules are really about culture or people in leadership who are incentivizing some things and not other things. And so I would just, we all have a million things to do on our chore list, but spending some time being reflective about that to figure out what it is that you feel like is really limiting you.
Thanks, Nichole. Can you speak just a little bit about whether you see a relationship between philanthropy and the public sector? Like, are there ways that philanthropy can actually impact or leverage the public sector in some way?
Yeah, I think that philanthropy has a very important role, but I think it's nuanced. So, a lot of folks kind of look at Group Health Foundation and they're sort of like, wow, you're one of the larger foundations in the state of Washington, right? But we actually have we roughly have about the same amount of money as the ACH that Liz Baxter runs over the life of her 5-year program, right? If you think about our total grant making, it's actually our total grant making a year is less than the general fund budget for the county of Okanagan. So we have to be really thoughtful and think about, what is the comparison and the thought around how much money philanthropy has compared to actual public resources. And, philanthropy likes to be more important than maybe what our budget may justify. But truth be told, our total assets, even in a state like Washington with pretty significant philanthropic wealth, it's still a budget rounding error when you look at the state of Washington's budget. So what's been problematic in the last several decades is, as folks have disinvested in government and government infrastructure, philanthropy has, for very good intention and for very good reason, tried to step in and fill some of those gaps. And what ends up happening is that the basic services and programs that our counties, our states, and our cities should be paying for, there has been this shift that that's the role of philanthropy. And so what I think philanthropy's role is to organize communities, support and honor their expertise, and ensure that they have the power, the leverage, and the voice to hold our government systems accountable and to help reimagine and test and try things out so that our several billion dollar, tens of billions of dollars state budget can actually be reorganized and reconstructed to match who Washington is today. There are so many things we do across this state and in our home communities that we have not changed how we're doing it for the last several decades. And meanwhile, our populations have completely changed. And so I think philanthropy has an important role to really follow and support communities so they have the voice and the power they have always deserved to help our governments be accountable and innovative and designed to match who we are today.
Thank you. And knowing that you have to catch a flight, I'm going to get you to like 2 more questions, if that's okay. There are a couple of folks who've just put comments in the Q&A box that I hope you get a chance to look at, just thanking you for both speaking up about the non-Seattle areas of Washington and also just being like somebody from the, communities of color, from the BIPOC community, And so there's a question about like how to leverage greater funding for rural areas, as well as how to leverage greater funding for organizations that are led by people of color and serving communities of color.
Thanks for that, Liz. And I also, like, I'm just going to give a little comment here. As I was writing these remarks and thinking about how to share my story, I just want to say to all the folks in Seattle, I have mad love for you. And I know there are profound inequities in whole communities that live throughout King County who get excluded by philanthropy and are not engaged in the way. So inequity is in every corner, but I just wanted to take a note to say that particular piece. What I can share about the way we have approached our work to be a statewide organization and to ensure that we have a broad range of different size of organizations and a broad range of different geography. So I'll just tell a little bit about our story. And there's some things that we did that, not everyone appreciates. We made the choice when we did our community visits. I mentioned some of the communities we prioritized visiting, but we also did a whole other set of prioritizing, which was to go to the counties that had the least philanthropic investment. And we actually chose to go to the counties that our staff knew the least about. So, I shared about my long Washington roots. So the first place I visited was actually Ferry, Stevens, and Pend Oreille County, because I did not know as much as I wanted to or should know about those places. So the first place I visited was in Chelan, Washington. And that's how we kind of approach those visits, is like really starting in those places. And so we were in Wahkiakum and Pacific and Grays Harbor first. And the other thing that's tricky is that, part of the reason that we got so many emails from nonprofits in the Seattle area is they have the resources to have a development director to understand what a foundation payout is, all those things. And so what was so great about that experience was a lot of the folks we met with, they had never had a foundation visit them. They oftentimes thought I was there to sell them health insurance and or do a public health department assessment, which I was always sort of like, why would you meet with me if you thought I was here to sell you health insurance? And so many times I got the answer, well, we felt sorry for you. You seem like you were driving really far. So I think, that piece of really deciding where you go first, because, we could have filled up 3 years with meetings of folks who had really strong fundraisers on their staff that knew to reach out and ask for that meeting. So by doing this other thing, we had to say no to so many awesome people just so that we could balance the geography. So being judicious with time and attention. The other piece is that our first funding initiatives, we were really clear that it was really about us learning our state and building relationships. And we prioritized smaller organizations that were newer. Certainly there's a bunch of like historical organizations that have been around forever, but have just not been resourced well. And we just knew that once we got up and running, if we did our grant making for kind of larger organizations first, it would be so much harder to go back and then prioritize smaller organizations. So we did that. And then, the thing I would say is, once you go and you meet all these different leaders and organizations across the state, like you can't unlearn that, you can't unsee it. And so I'm a little bit unpopular at cocktail parties and social events now, because when folks are like, oh, there's just no nonprofits, I'm like, well, let me tell you about 45 nonprofits I met in the Tri-Cities or, wherever. And then the last thing I'd say is, we have awesome mid-sized cities across Washington. Like, Vancouver is a big, important city that's incredibly diverse. The Tri-Cities is amazing. Spokane is a giant metropolis. And so, the other way I'm kind of annoying in social and philanthropic circles is those mid-sized cities still to this day, by our health system leaders and in philanthropy, like people are still calling them rural communities. And, you know, I'm sort of like a broken record where I'm like, Spokane, the greater Spokane area has 600,000 people. Like there's a lot of really important rural communities around there. Please do not leave them out. I will, you know, when it is safe, I will gladly take you on a visit there. But I just think we have so much to learn. And the spirit we have undertaken is that there's so much we don't know, and we just have to keep learning. And we're probably, you know, we're a 3-year-old at this point as an organization. So we're probably dangerous. Like we think we learned some things, but it's our forever journey. And so we have to keep pushing ourselves to interrupt any misperceptions.
I appreciate having another colleague who's annoying to have around. So I'm going to leave the last question for Marilyn Scott, who's the vice chairman of the Upper Skagit tribe. And Marilyn has asked, have you had the experience of resistance in the direction that you're leading your philanthropy activity into this future of diversity, and how would you respond?
Yeah, it's not, that's a great question. And Marilyn, I remember meeting you and getting the pleasure of sitting next to you in the amazing gathering that Liz hosted in Bellingham. So I love that I know exactly who's asking this question. And so we definitely have folks who do not agree with our vision, or or feel uncomfortable because of the disruption that will be required in order for this vision to take hold. The thing that's a little like, you know, part of the deal with philanthropy is folks usually are not as direct with how they feel to you. And the other thing is it's not that socially acceptable to say, I'm against leadership in the state of Washington being more diverse. So no one's like coming out and saying that, but what folks say is kind of this other second level, which is, that's so great, y'all want to do that, but what we, you know, we have an opportunity now to do something very efficient, or we have to move fast because communities X, Y, and Z need this, and clearly we as the mainstream institution are the most poised to do that for them. So there's usually not the overt I'm against reflective democracy. It's much more for the sake of those people, let's please invite me to lead on their behalf. And I think the other part is that so I think we've experienced a lot of that feedback, and I think we also we are a field that is not held accountable in the way that I think we should be. And so even when folks are like, why aren't they moving faster? Or, you know, what are they doing? I kind of love that, because someone should be asking those questions of philanthropy. And I would also say, you know, culturally as an organization, we're not the organization that sends out the email that's like, here's the money we gave away. And because we really believe that we're not actually the ones doing the work. It's the nonprofit organizations and institutions who are leading, doing the work. They were doing it long before we ever came along. The things that we are funding are really the manifestation of leaders over many generations, volunteers, other people who have funded the work. And so we are one factor coming in and supporting it. And so the way we tell our story about what we're doing is a little bit quieter. And I think that has opened us up to some criticism that I actually welcome. Yeah.
Nichole, just thank you so much for taking the time this morning. You're both inspiring and challenging words. And I know that you need to run. So if you need to jump off, just know that there are lots of words of gratitude that are coming in. Just people are just really grateful for the inspiration that you're giving today.
Oh,
So
it's my
thank you.
honor to be here with all of you. And this last 8 months, my community visits have very much been interrupted. So it's been a really, there's a lot of things that have been really hard about this time, but not being in community
Yeah.
has been particularly hard. So I'm just so glad to be here. Thank you so much, Liz, for your leadership, and certainly to all of you in the audience today.
All right. All right. So before I give just some closing remarks, we're going to turn this over to Michael Arness and Michelle Needham from the Healthcare Authority. So if the two of you would like to unmute and show your faces, that would be awesome.
Liz, good afternoon. Well, that was a wonderful way to conclude. And I think my first takeaway would be to remain forever 3 years old. If that's what it takes, that's what I'm going to do. Liz, I just want to first just thank Bonnie Winterstrom, all of the accountable communities of health, yourself, Liz, and the Artemis team that we all worked with. This kind of symposium, I think, was wonderful. And if people could see the months that went into this ahead of time and the wonderful planning, I think they would not be surprised. The sessions were just terrific. I think the one thing that I heard so much was that this is probably, this equity work is some of the hardest work that people have taken on. They also said it was some of the most important, necessary, and by far rewarding work that they've ever done. And that seems like once you get on the journey, you'll never get off. And that's, I think, a good thing for all of us to remember as we conclude this particular session. I really appreciate being able to listen to pretty much every session. So thank you so much. Michelle, I'm sure you have a word or two. Let me turn it over to you, please.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Liz, for inviting us to participate in the closing comments. I would echo Michael's thank you for the entire team that put this symposium together. It was a really good demonstration of the teamwork and the partnership across all 9 ACHs, Healthcare Authority, Artemis team, and all the community partners that you all brought to various sessions. I guess I should have introduced myself. I'm Michelle Needham. I'm the Chief Policy Officer for the Healthcare Authority. So sorry for not saying that first. I just also want to echo that it's been a great 3 days, not just because I've learned a lot, and I'm sure all of you have learned a lot, but it also has been filled with good news and positive stories and hope at a time that I'm sure many of us feel the need to find those rays of sunshine, and just hope that we can continue to work together and really make some great progress. So I think I was asked to keep this very brief because we're coming to the closing for the 3 days, but I just can't echo enough my appreciation for all of the work and the tremendous set of conversations that you really sponsored throughout this, and the demonstration of the authentic community engagement and that critical voice that's so important that you keep bringing to the table to help us all transform together. So thank you very much.
All right. Thanks,
back to you,
Michael
Liz.
and Michelle. All righty. So I've been asked to close us up. So I would like to start by just thanking all of the presenters and panelists, my colleagues among the ACH executives, and to the folks who have dialed in. Over the past 3 mornings, we've had close to 900 people who have joined one or more of the sessions, which is really pretty incredible to think about. We spent the mornings hearing from local organizations who are working in community with ACHs. We're grateful to the Healthcare Authority for making the resources available so that this event could occur. And for the folks you saw and the folks you didn't see, from Bonnie Winterstrom agreeing to be the MC, Diana Bianco and Kathy Kaufman behind the scenes who did all of the work organizing this, and support from staff from several of our ACHs who've been taking care of the technical assistance on the Zoom line. Just thank you. This would not have happened without you. Just also want to share that getting to an agreement that the theme this year would focus on equity and race was a big deal. And it took some courage on the part of the state agency. And really the onus is on us to move this work forward and figure out what happens next in our organizations and within ourselves. But please know that you're not alone. You can reach out to any one of the ACHs if you'd like more information about how you or your team can join on this, what we're thinking in North Sound as a tribal and equity learning journey. On Monday, you heard from John Powell. He talked about targeted universalism, and it is an approach that North Sound has embedded since 2017. And that's just an FYI for anybody who ever questioned why North Sound chose all 8 project areas. It was because we were using that framing of targeted universalism, and it has shaped how we selected our partners, how we've distributed our funds, and a number of other things. But I want to share another quote from a colleague, David Gibbs, who's with Community Initiatives. And he said, if we build on the idea that racism is a disease, then we should bring the same rigor and science to eliminate the disease as we do with others. Treatment without diagnosis is malpractice. And so for those who've asked over the last 3 mornings, like, how do we figure out what we want to do? What are the actions that we want to take? Just remember that these steps of learning and inquiry and kind of curiosity about how we've gotten to where we are incredibly important before identifying what we should do next. But after these 3 mornings, I have I think there are 4 thoughts. My counting is always bad when it comes to thinking about my thoughts. Our lack of ability and or willingness to address equity is putting people's livelihoods and their lives at greater risk. So the decision to address this cannot be a democratic decision. The fact that there are some people who are asking, like, why are we talking about this? Why is our agency spending time on this? Is not enough of a reason to make it less important. This should not be optional. There's an imperative for us to find strategies to address equity and racism across our state. And as one of my own board members wrote in the Q&A yesterday, this is not about adding more things to our plate. This is the plate. So I will close with just expressing gratitude for all of you who joined us. We look forward to working together in the times ahead outside of the box. Love to be able to see everybody in person. There is going to be an evaluation of the Learning Symposium. It's going to be emailed out later today. Please fill it out because we value your feedback and would love to know which parts of this worked and what we could do better at. And just as a last reminder, all of the sessions, including slides that were shared, will be posted to the ACH website, hopefully by tomorrow, with a little bit of an asterisk about John's presentation. We're going to get that up as soon as we can. So, the onus is on us to figure out what happens next. And I just want to thank you on behalf of an incredibly large team. We look forward to seeing you sometime again soon, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, Liz.